He was the most famous philosopher who ever lived. A philosopher is someone who studies life, knowledge, and truth. His name was Socrates, and he lived in the city-state of Athens over 2,000 years ago. The stories about Socrates describe him as the most down-to-earth fellow you could ever meet. If someone is down to earth, he is realistic, honest, and straightforward. These stories, written by his friends and students, tell us all we know about him, for Socrates never wrote anything down himself. According to these stories, there was no one more clever, no one more loyal to his friends, no one so willing to poke fun at himself, and no one as glad to share everyday activities with other people. But the one thing that made Socrates such a great philosopher was that he kept asking questions about why people did such everyday things. In the stories about Socrates, we hear about him sitting beneath a shady tree or walking with friends, always engaged in curious conversation. In one story, many guests are waiting for him to arrive at a dinner party. The guests and their host, a man named Agathon, are wealthy, well-educated young Athenians who talk about sports, politics, and the latest plays. Some help run their families' large farms or travel to faraway lands on business trips as merchants. Some are political leaders in Athens. A few are soldiers. None of them, however, spend their lives like Socrates, just thinking and asking questions to answer other questions. In this story, Socrates is older than the rest of the guests at this party, has almost no money to his name, wears the same outfit day and night, and generally walks about without shoes. Yet in this and other stories, we hear politicians, landowners, and soldiers speak of him with great affection or liking and respect. At the dinner party, one Athenian says, "One day Socrates and I were passing through the marketplace. I bought a number of items for myself, and knowing Socrates has little money, I offered to buy him whatever he wanted. Socrates said, 'One reason for human unhappiness is that people always want more things than they need. When they get those things, they still want more. I think the happiest people are the ones with the least number of things. Just look at all these marvelous things in the marketplace that I don't want.'" Another dinner guest shares a very different memory of Socrates. "During the war, when we were soldiers together in that icy, cold winter, everyone else bundled up in as many clothes as possible. But Socrates gave another man his coat and boots, saying, 'You need these more than I do.' He marched barefoot, even over the ice, yet he outmarched the rest of us. And when we ran low on food, he still shared his food with others. Yet during the battle, he was the strongest of us all. And though I received honors for bravery that day, Socrates was the real hero. Yes, I led the charge, but I became surrounded by enemy soldiers. Just as one of them knocked my sword from my hand, Socrates burst through them, scattering them right and left. Then he glared at them so fiercely they ran away. He found me another sword and then said, 'If I had known that making ugly faces could drive the enemy away, I could have won the battle for us. For heaven knows I am ugly enough for that.'" As the guest finishes this retelling, Socrates himself finally arrives for the party. Agathon, the host, insists, "Sit next to me, Socrates, so that I can hear your words of wisdom." Socrates laughs. "I fear you'll go thirsty, Agathon, for I have no wisdom for you to hear. I have only questions, not answers. In all of the stories about Socrates, we read that his method of learning and teaching was to ask others questions like, how do you know? And what do you mean? For example, someone might say to him, the way to lead a good life is to give to others, to which Socrates might respond, how do you know? By asking these questions, Socrates really wanted to cause people to think about their lives and why they do certain things. Otherwise, he would say, we will just repeat the same old mistakes everyone else has made. And when we end up doing good things, shouldn't we try to understand why they are good so that we can do more good things? Somehow it was always in his company that people had moments of enlightenment. Enlightenment means the act of being aware of problems or concerns. Of course, some people did not like Socrates. They said that he was wasting their time or confusing them by trying to change their minds. Socrates protested, but I cannot change your mind, only you can do that. Then he would go on his way. Many of Socrates' friends went on to become great leaders of Greece, and many of his students became widely known and respected. One such student was an intelligent young fellow named Plato. Poet, champion athlete, and brave soldier, Plato paid close attention to what Socrates said. Later in his life, Plato wrote books reporting those wonderful discussions. But as years passed and Plato became famous himself, he wrote more about his own ideas about the world and less about Socrates. Finally, Plato opened a school near a grove of olive trees called the Grove of Academe. The school became famous as the Academy, a word we still use today for some schools. Here, Plato offered classes in all sorts of subjects: history, mathematics, music, literature, law, politics, and more. He would always ask, what do we know about these things? How can we be sure we are correct? How can our knowing lead to greater happiness? But by the time Plato taught at the Academy, Athens had changed. It had gone through a long, terrible war. A terrible disease had swept through the city, a disease today we might be able to treat with modern medicine. Without such medicine, many Athenians died from this illness. Many of the happy young men and women of Plato's youth did not survive. Life was no longer so easy or happy for him. He then began writing books that asked questions like, wouldn't life be nicer if we could only, and continued to try to find proof to back up his ideas. Proof means evidence, or facts that support that something is true. Among Plato's students was a young man named Aristotle. Aristotle, too, wanted to understand people and things, but he looked at them in a way more like Socrates than Plato. Aristotle thought, instead of looking for facts to prove what we already think is true, let us first study the facts and then try to understand what they mean. So Aristotle studied the facts, or things he knew were true, and tried to find out more about them. That simple idea would change the world. Aristotle would become the first great observer, studying things he could see and experiment with, such as plants, animals, human beings, and the stars and planets. Aristotle's ideas and classifications are still used in science today. Aristotle also believed in the importance of having balance in life. He thought doing or having too much of one thing, such as staying up too late, eating too many unhealthy foods, or even studying too much, did not allow time for other things you may need to do. So Aristotle thought that too much of anything wasn't good, and that it was important to have a balance of different things. Aristotle, like his teacher Plato, also opened a school in Athens. Aristotle's students and the books he wrote spread across Greece and beyond, carrying Greek ideas to distant lands. So Aristotle became a philosopher like his teacher Plato before him, and his teacher's teacher Socrates before that. Among Aristotle's students was an astonishing or surprisingly amazing boy who would carry these ideas the farthest of all. His name was Alexander, and you will learn about him in the next read aloud.